Euclid's first common notion is this: things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. That's a rule of mathematical reasoning. It's true because it works. Has done and always will do. In his book, Euclid says this is self-evident. You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law. It is a self-evident truth that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other.
That was a clip from Lincoln. We're delighted to welcome its director, Steven Spielberg, back to the show. Steven, good afternoon. I'm in London. You're in Paris. Mark's in Southampton.
Hello, everybody, everywhere.
Now, we're doing this. Mark, you can't get to London because of the snow, and Steven can't get to London because of the snow. So we'll do like this three-way interview, but it's a privilege to have you back on the show, Steven. Can you just start things going by telling us about Lincoln? It's not really the biopic of a man, as the title might suggest, so much as the biopic of a piece of legislation. So let's take it away.
Well, the film is about the man, but it's about the man and his working process, as it is also about the man and his personal process with his wife and two sons. So it does go back and forth between his life at home and his life trying to put the country back together again after the Civil War. The story only takes place in a 4-month window between January and April of 1865, but it is primarily a kind of anatomy of the experiment of democracy to see whether or not Lincoln would be able to gather enough votes from a Congress very much opposed to emancipation, and whether he is able to pass this constitutional amendment, the 13th Amendment, which would, by and large, bring slavery to an end. And so the story is a very, detailed look into the political process, but it's also a very, very soulful look into the life and heart of Abraham Lincoln.
And can you, to a British audience maybe less sort of immersed into the politics of Congress of 1865, there'll be some British folk watching this going, right, so the Republicans are for this amendment, the Democrats are against, and then there are radicals, and I'm trying to piece it all together. Can you just paint a picture of the way Congress was in 1865?
Well, the Democrats in 1865, they were the conservative, ultra-conservative party. They were the agrarian party, and they were the party of the slave owners, because the Democratic Party represented the farmers, and cotton was the staple byproduct of the agrarian culture in that whole era. And the Progressive Party, the Liberal Party, the party that was in favor of big government and higher taxes, was, ironically, the Republican Party. Completely polar opposites today. And that's a whole other story, how the two parties switched their political places. But for the most part, inside the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln's party, there were radical Republicans that didn't think Lincoln was moving fast enough. Tommy Lee Jones represents a radical Republican named Thaddeus Stevens, who is ostensibly on Lincoln's side, but also is a thorn in his side, because Lincoln goes at a steady, moderate pace, and Thaddeus Stevens was very impatient with the timing of Abraham Lincoln. So there's a lot of drama and comedy between those two characters.
At the center of that conflict between Thaddeus and Lincoln, there's an ongoing discussion about radicalism versus moderation. And it seemed to me, more than anything, the thing that the story was about the value of moderation. And what happens to Tommy Lee Jones's character is that he, during the course of the drama, having believed in these very, very radical ideals, learns to understand something about compromise. And I was wondering whether or not that story is particularly relevant at the moment with the American politics, whether you thought that was something that particularly spoke to this moment as well as the historical story.
Well, I feel that in our story and across the landscape of the political, process, the democratic process, compromise is usually the best way to get something done. And they say that if both sides are unhappy with the compromise, then something has actually gotten done. Both sides aren't supposed to be happy in a true compromise. But in this case, there was a grand essential working here, and that was 750,000 Americans had already been killed by the end of the Civil War. And slavery was still thriving, and the war was fought over slavery. And Lincoln needed to end slavery before the war ended. Lincoln knew he could end the war early. They were on the brink of it anyway, but he needed to get this amendment through. The blood on Lincoln's hands, because the war was delayed to get this amendment passed, is something that he knew he would have to live with. But at the same time, you know, Lincoln had to make compromises. Every single character in the story, including the Democrats, many of them staunchly against this amendment, had to make compromises for the greater good.
Do you think there's any particular reason why at the moment we have Django has just opened in UK cinemas, Lincoln is just opening now, and the two movies are going head to head in many of the major award ceremonies? They couldn't be more different as films. They're very, very different beasts. But do you think there's any reason why we have two movies and others as well dealing particularly now with slavery?
No, there's no reason at all, except the reason that often, invites similar subjects to come to movie theaters in the same year. This happens quite often, and not just in this genre, but in other genres too. That's really not our. We don't engineer that. These are not like guided missiles. We simply make our movies, and when it's time to release them, they get released. This was just the time for Django, and it was the time for Lincoln. It doesn't mean that we colluded or conspired to have these films come out to make some kind of a grand statement about slavery. I made a movie about slavery in 1997 called Amistad.
Amistad. Yeah.
Schindler's List is about slavery, and The Color Purple, in a sense, is about slavery. So it's a subject that has interested me for a long time as a filmmaker.
There's a great comic moment in Lincoln, and we've seen him doing what can only be described as ruling by anecdote. And at one moment, whenever he's asked a question, he goes into a story, which then becomes like a parable to answer it. And at one moment in your film, somebody slams the table and says, "I can't listen to this anymore. I can't hear another one of your stories." Do we know that is genuinely how Lincoln would rule and how he would have those discussions?
Well, the gentleman who couldn't stand Lincoln's stories was the Secretary of War, Stanton. And Stanton couldn't stand Lincoln's stories because Stanton would just stand by the telegraph waiting for word of a battle. And, he was just waiting for word whether they took the day or not. And Lincoln would always kind of relax everybody with an anecdote or a shaggy dog story or something to just relax the room. And Stanton would have none of it. And he said, "You're going to tell another story. I can't right now take another one of your stories." And he walks out of the room, and Lincoln, of course, laughs as Stanton walks out of the room, and he continues with the story. That doesn't stop him. Nothing could stop Lincoln when he had a story that he needed to tell.
On the subject of Daniel Day-Lewis, whose performance is extraordinary, you pursued him, you knew exactly who you wanted to play Lincoln. Can you just tell us why you were so determined to get Daniel Day-Lewis to play your president?
Well, there's nobody else I imagine could play Abraham Lincoln, and I didn't want anybody else but him to play Lincoln, and I went to him with not the Tony Kushner script, but a different script that I had developed about the Civil War and the Lincoln presidency in 2003 and 2004 with a rewrite, and he turned me down both times. But I was not going to be dissuaded, and because I just knew that it was his destiny and mine to do this together, and I've always wanted to work with him. He's arguably the greatest actor in the world. And I knew he could absolutely transform himself into any character that had enough gravitational pull to invite Daniel into the life and the name. So I just was patient and persistent.
Have you ever spent longer courting an actor?
Never. I didn't spend this long courting my wife.
Was it, Mark's just mentioned Django, but one of the stars of that, Leonardo DiCaprio. Is it true that it was a phone call from Leonardo DiCaprio to Daniel Day-Lewis which sort of started this, maybe Daniel Day-Lewis thinking, well, okay, maybe I need to look at this script again?
Yeah, I don't know what would have happened if Leo hadn't made the phone call, but Leo came over for dinner, and we were just me and Leo and my wife, and we were just talking about stuff, and he asked me what about your Lincoln project? And I told him the long, sad story. And the project was sort of on hold right now. I was not able to get Daniel to entertain the third read of a script, and a completely different script. This one now by Tony Kushner, based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's book Team of Rivals. And I couldn't get to Daniel, didn't know him, didn't know anybody around him in his sphere. And Leo didn't offer at that moment to do anything. He just listened to my story. And I got a call the next morning at the office, and it was Leo. And he said, "You have a pencil?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Write this number down. It's Daniel's cell phone. He's expecting your call." And, Leo got to Daniel probably very, very early in the morning and in Daniel's evening. And Daniel said he would read the script. And that started the entire enterprise. We started pulling out of the station because of what Leo did.
There are no recordings of Abraham Lincoln's voice. I wondered if, from your point of view of the director, the man who finally persuaded Daniel Day-Lewis to do this project, was there a moment when you could see that he had it, or did that emerge over the process of the year that he asked you if he could have to sort of get the character?
One day, Daniel, asked me to do some research into the possible combination of dialects or accents based on the fact that Lincoln was basically Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois in his upbringing. And I found a radio documentary series made in the early 1950s interviewing farmers in Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and other states. But I gathered just those accents, those recordings of three of those states where Lincoln could have been influenced, and just sent Daniel hours and hours. And Daniel, I don't know what he did. I'd never asked Daniel about his process because I knew it was a very private thing, and I did not want to violate Daniel's confidentiality with himself and preparing for any movie role. But all I know is one day Daniel sent me a tape recording of himself, and I pressed play, and I heard for the first time Abraham Lincoln speaking to me. And I phoned Daniel immediately. He was living in Ireland, and I just said, "I just talked to Lincoln." And Daniel said, "I'm glad you think so." And that was the accent, that was the voice, and that was it. I made no adjustments, I made no suggestions. That was the character.
And is it true that whilst you were on set, when he was in character, you would refer to him only as Sir? You wouldn't call him Daniel or anything?
No. I didn't call any of the actors by their first names or last names. I called everybody by their character names. I just wanted to create an ambience on the set. I wanted people to come to the set and feel they were stepping out of the 21st century and back into time. So I called Tommy Lee Jones Mr. Stevens. I called David Strathairn Mr. Secretary. He was the Secretary of State. I called Sally Field, has been my friend for 40 years. I called her Molly or Mary Todd. And, of course, I called Daniel Mr. President. And that was just something that I wanted to do as much for me as for them. And no one on the set, matter of fact, this set was so different than anything else I've ever done. For one thing, usually on the set, people bring their newspapers or the trades, and in between shots, they're reading or they're looking at, doing crossword puzzles or doing sports scores or talking about Mad Men or something that they just saw on television, some particularly fine episode. And for some reason, every single actor, and this was 145 speaking parts in this picture, no one brought the 21st century or anything relevant to it to the working experience. We really, really stayed very, very much in another time period.
We're talking to Steven Spielberg. We'll do more in just a moment. This is 5 Live. Steven Spielberg is with us. Mark is in Southampton. Steven is in Paris. We're just talking about the process by which Lincoln was put together. And that White House experience that you created, Steven, must have been, as you say, you've never worked like that. What did you take from that? Was there anything from that process that you think would then work on any other movie, or was it unique to Lincoln?
Well, I've made a lot of movies in other periods, but this was the most literary and performance-dependent movie of my career. And because of that, in a sense, I felt I was a little bit more on the boards on stage than I was on a film set. And so I just thought it would just help me in my own, belief in the subject matter. And it did help me. I, in a sense, I've never done that before in a film. I guess you could call that method directing, which I've never done in my entire life. But it did put me in a different frame of mind. And it allowed me to make visual choices that were not going to be too loud for the movie, that weren't going to attempt to be more flashy or upstage the story, the script, or Daniel Day-Lewis. So I kept a very quiet lens. I kept my camera very quiet, meaning I didn't do anything tricky. The film simply, or my process as the filmmaker, I simply didn't want to cast a shadow longer than the president's.
I wonder if I'm not quite sure whether this is a very sensible thing to do, particularly given what you've just told us about Daniel Day-Lewis. But I wanted to read out some words of Abraham Lincoln to you. And I'm a Londoner. Daniel Day-Lewis was born in London. I'm not auditioning for another role, you understand. But
well, yeah, if it's good, I might hire you.
Okay. Well, look, I'm reading it out because it's a letter from Abraham Lincoln to the cotton workers of Lancashire, and it was written on this day 150 years ago. So we're speaking on the 19th of January. And this was written on the 19th of January, 1863, to the cotton workers of Lancashire who had supported the North. And they had passed a motion saying that they supported the North, and this was costing them because clearly this was their living, and they were aware that the cotton that they were handling had been slave cotton. So that they'd taken this step at great cost to themselves. And Abraham Lincoln, and I feel very nervous reading this out because it's you listening, Stephen. So if you'll excuse my diction. Abraham Lincoln writing 150 years ago today. I cannot but regard your decisive utterances on the question as an instance of sublime Christian heroism which has not been surpassed in any age or in any country. It is indeed an energetic and re-inspiring assurance of the inherent truth and of the ultimate and universal triumph of justice, humanity, and freedom. Whatever misfortune may befall your country or my own, the peace and friendship which now exist between the two nations will be, as it shall be my desire to make them, perpetual. Now that's pretty good stuff, isn't it, Stephen?
I think Lincoln was the greatest writer of the 19th century. I really do. He was admired by so many great poets and writers. Mark Twain, later Carl Sandburg, Longfellow. He was an extraordinary writer, and it's not that there even needed to be an olive branch extended across the sea, but what a beautiful, beautiful, heartfelt expression of his pride and his deep commitment to the issue of abolishing slavery.
How was my performance?
Beautiful. I mean, very lovely. You should do what you're doing. You're very good at this.
Okay, all right.
Okay, right. Enough of this now. Yeah, I felt that Lincoln was in the room, but enough of being nice to Simon. Stephen, I wonder if I can ask you something about when you look back over an extraordinary body of work that you've made. Does your relationship with the movies change? And I ask you particularly because, I'm a film critic, and I'm sure that in the position that you're in, what film critics say doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. But I had a strange experience in the past couple of years. When I first saw AI, when AI first came out, I was not a fan of it, and it wasn't a movie that engaged with me, and I thought it was a misfire. In the last few years, my wife became really, really obsessed with AI, and she's a professor of film, and she said to me, "You've got this film wrong, you need to see it again." And I started watching it again and found myself reduced to floods of tears by it. And it is now my favourite Steven Spielberg movie. And I wondered whether your own relationship with your back catalogue fluctuates in the same way. Or has it always been that you know the ones that you love and you know the ones that you're not so proud of?
I don't give myself the opportunity, except through the eyes of my own children, to see my films, to watch my movies. So I don't go back and look at my old movies. I haven't seen AI in a long, long time. And the reason I haven't is I haven't showed it to my kids yet. And part of, the whole thing, and when we come out on Blu-ray, for instance, I have to certainly check the transfer from standard definition to high definition. But when I do it always without sound, just with pictures. So I really don't look at my movies, and I keep promising myself someday I will. I want to see Hook again because I still don't like that movie, and I'm hoping someday I'll see it again and perhaps like some of it. AI, of course, was a sentimental favorite of mine because it's really the first time ever anybody's ever worked with a ghost, and I did. I had Stanley Kubrick with me every single day shooting that picture, and because it was his story from beginning to end. It was my screenplay, but it was a 90-page treatment he wrote with Ian Watson, so it was quite a detailed treatment I was able to base my screenplay on. And so that movie has a very special place in my heart because Stanley is in one of my most important godfathers.
Well, I'd just like to say officially on behalf of film critics, I got it wrong when that film came out, and I apologise to you because it's a masterpiece.
And Stephen, I have to tell you, an apology from Mark about getting something wrong is an event where you should make a movie out of it.
Well, let me tell you, this has only happened to me once before when Vincent Canby panned Close Encounters, and 3 years later changed his mind and wrote a glowing review. So this is only the second time this has ever happened to me. So thank you.
Well, and just finally, Stephen, you spoke earlier of a quiet lens. Will you have a quiet lens for Jurassic Park 5 or Robo-Apocalypse, or will it be a noisy lens?
Well, Jurassic Park 5, I'm just a producer. I'm not the director. So I won't be bringing my lens to Jurassic, just, my producing chops, whatever that means. And Robo is back in development. I'm sure I'll make it, soon, but not as soon as I was going to make it.
Steven Spielberg, we thank you so much for your time and I really appreciate you being with us today.
Okay, thanks. And thank you, Linda, for seeing AI again and watching it with your husband again. That meant a lot to me, what he just said.
Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
That's terrific. We really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys.